Good morning. Hello everyone. It's springtime here at Underhill Workshop, and our Lord of the Rings theme for this diorama build is the Battle of the Last Alliance, an ancient battle from the Second Age of Middle-earth, which takes place of course in the land of Mordor, on the slopes of Mount Doom. And as we know, one does not simply walk into Mordor. It is a barren wasteland riddled with fire and ash and dust. The very air you breathe is a poisonous, I'm sure you know the rest. Anyway, being a barren wasteland will need plenty of rock terrain, so I started off by making a batch of plaster rocks using some Woodland Scenics rock molds. I mixed up some plaster of Paris to a nice thin consistency for pouring into the rock molds. I pre-sprayed all of the rock molds with some water first. I used some chunks of foam scraps to roughly level out and support the molds before pouring in the plaster mix. Bits of rags or screwed up paper towels work great for this as well. Then I poured in the plaster mix, working it into the molds with a wooden pop stick. Once that was finished, I left the plaster to set for a couple of hours, then carefully removed all the rocks from the molds and put them all aside into boxes for later. I sketched out a quick drawing of the basic layout and construction of the diorama, starting with a base and also a vertical backdrop for the battle scene. The base and backdrop will house a hidden cavity of molten rock underneath them. Then we'll cover the base and backdrop with a top layer holding the rocky terrain. Because there's going to be lots of wiring and LED lighting in this diorama, we need to have somewhere underneath or behind the base to store and hide all of the wiring. So a wooden base frame with a hollow recess is perfect for this. I made the base using some wood glue, lengths of pine and some 3mm plywood sheet, clamped together overnight until it was all set. I made a second hollow recessed timber frame for the vertical backdrop of the diorama. I drew a line in pencil marking the height of the base along the bottom of the vertical backdrop. Then I started arranging the plaster rocks into place. I cut another sheet of 3mm plywood up to the mark line, which will sit in front of the vertical backdrop and hold the plaster rocks. I then transferred all the rocks in the arranged formation onto the new sheet of plywood, marking their position with a pencil. And then it was just a matter of marking and cutting some smaller plaster rocks to fit all the remaining gaps. I used an old utility knife to score the rocks before breaking them into smaller pieces to fit. After fitting and marking all their positions with a pencil, I removed all the rocks and started to mark out where I wanted to cut the crevices for the molten lava effects in the vertical backdrop. Using a Dremel rotary tool with a cutting bit to cut out all the crevices will be pretty noisy and dusty work, so I decided to move outside for this. I geared up with a dust mask, some earmuffs and safety goggles. The Dremel works great for this sort of thing, but because it's a high speed rotating bit, it's important to take a bit of extra care, as it does sometimes tend to quickly grab the timber and run away from you, as you can see by the numerous wayward trailing marks I left behind. It's not a problem though, as we actually won't see these marks in the final build. I used some coarse sandpaper to give it a quick sand, then I used a jigsaw to trim the plywood to the correct size for the base. I cut a piece of 12mm MDF sheet to sit behind the 3mm plywood vertical backdrop, leaving a margin which I marked below, to accommodate the interlocking bottom base, which we'll get to later. I then repositioned the rocks to double check that I was happy with their exact positioning, and then I started marking the overhanging plaster rocks. I decided to add another crevice on the vertical backdrop, so I marked it and popped back outside to cut that one out too. Then I marked with pencil all of the cutouts for the backdrop crevices onto the 12mm MDF sheet below. I marked out a margin around all of the crevices. This will house the sculpts of molten rock details that we'll be building onto a second layer behind the backdrop. I popped back outside to cut this out with the jigsaw. This 12mm MDF will now sit behind our 3mm plywood sheet. I used the hacksaw to trim the overhanging plaster rock, checking it on the backdrop to make sure it fitted okay. A few rocks that wobbled or weren't sitting level on the backdrop, I sanded using some 80 grit sandpaper. I carried on trimming and adding the plaster rocks, and then it was time to fix them to the backdrop using a hot glue gun. For the most realistic rocky terrain effects, it's best to fit and add as many rocks as possible to minimise the flat exposed areas of wood that are showing. But we'll cover all of the exposed timber with sculpting compound afterwards anyway, so it's no problem to leave some of the timber showing. Then it was time to double check that everything fit together properly and mark out the inside cavity onto the original backdrop frame. I then marked out the positions of the crevices as well onto the backdrop frame. I cut out a second sheet of 12mm MDF for the bottom base. I marked out the final positions of everything with a permanent marker. Then it was time to finally fix together the bottom base and vertical backdrop. I used some clamps to hold the two frames in place and drilled some pilot holes before fixing them together with some screws and washers. Now that everything was fitting together nicely, it was time to glue the 12mm MDF backdrop piece into place. But first of all, I cut another small round 12mm MDF piece to go underneath an overhanging section of the rock overlay, just for some extra strength and support. Everything was glued into place with wood glue and weighted down to set overnight. The next morning I selected some of the plaster rocks made earlier to go inside the molten cavity, fixing them in with hot glue to the cavity outlines marked earlier, so that they would be seen inside the cavity. I mixed up some paper mache based modelling compound, also known as sculpted or sculptor mold, to a nice workable consistency. Then began to fill the cavity around the rocks, sculpting a molten rock texture into it as I went. We'll be fixing the LEDs for lighting the molten rock cavity onto the edges around the cavity, so I made sure to leave some of the 12mm MDF edges exposed and free from the sculptor mould wherever I wanted the LEDs to go. I left the sculptor mould to dry and took the cutout piece left over from the cavity to mark an outline on a piece of aluminium foil. The idea is to hide the foil inside the cavity to reflect the light from the LEDs and give the molten cavity a much brighter glow from within. I cut round the line with some scissors and then placed the rocky backdrop onto a protective piece of spongy foam, fixing the foil in place with some removable blue painter's tape. By rubbing on the foil, the position of all the cavities was revealed, then marked with a permanent marker. After removing the tape, I cut out the cavities using a sharp utility knife. There's a bit of a knack to this, just to avoid tearing the delicate foil. It just requires going a little bit slowly while supporting the foil as much as possible. I used some wood glue, carefully spreading it around gently onto the foil with an old brush before fixing the foil onto the back of our rocky backdrop. I put down some baking paper and foam sheet, then mixed up some more Sculptamol and used a wooden pop stick to start filling between all the gaps of exposed timber on the backdrop. The Sculptamol gives a nice chunky texture, which we could just paint over as is. But to create a super realistic rock face, I like to go over the Sculptamol with some plaster of Paris, just to blend everything together seamlessly. It's a technique which takes a bit of extra time, but the final result is really worth it. Basically, I just add the plaster roughly on top of the Sculptamol. Then while it's still wet, I dip my finger into a cup of water before working the plaster around. The plaster absorbs the drop of water on your finger, and the extra water acts to spread and blend the plaster into the rocks to produce a really natural seamless effect between the rocks. It just requires working quickly while the plaster is still wet. For any tight narrow crevices, I just use the same technique but with a silicone sculpting tool instead, just to work the plaster right into the narrow gaps. Once the backdrop was finished, it was time to do exactly the same process on the horizontal bottom base. I cut another 3mm plywood sheet for the bottom base to sit on top of the 12mm MDF sheet, and laid out some more plaster rocks for the base. To temporarily hold up the vertical backdrop, I put 2 temporary screws into the top back corners of the diorama. I used these to hook some rubber bands around the top of the backdrop to hold it in place. Only one of them actually wanted to stay there, but it did the trick. I carefully positioned all of the rock terrain for the lower base. The idea was to have 2 ground levels for the diorama base, an upper level at the back against the rock wall, and the larger lower level in front of that, just to add some interest to the landscape, plus dividing up the battle scene into 2 different levels. Once the rocks were all positioned, it was time to carefully remove the diorama layers and then mark out the new rock positions on the upper ground level. I marked out a line in permanent marker for the front edge of the upper ground level, and also the position of the crevice to go below the rock formation. I popped back outside to cut these 2 newly marked lines with the jigsaw and Dremel, producing our template for the upper ground level. The cut lines were traced onto the 12mm MDF sheet underneath. Then I marked out a larger perimeter cut line for the cavity underneath the crevice. After cutting that out, we now have our cavity to house the molten rock underneath the base. I used some wood glue to fix this onto the base, using some weights and a piece of timber to clamp it down to set. While this was drying, I started hot gluing the plaster rock formations onto the 3mm plywood. It's important that we overhang the rocks surrounding the cavity so that we can't see the 3mm plywood sheet sitting underneath the rocks in the final build. Once the glue was set, I removed the weights, mixed up some more sculpture mould and filled the base cavity in the same way as the one on the vertical backdrop. I made sure to once again leave some of the 12mm MDF perimeter uncovered, just to allow us to fix some LEDs in place there later on. I hot glued a few more plaster rocks in place for terrain on the lower level. Oops. I wanted to pre-prepare a position on the rocks to stand the metal Sauron miniature for the battle scene, as it's quite large and heavy. I've been saving these minis for a project like this for ages, since about 2001, and this particular battle is such an awesome scene, so it's really cool to finally get to use them. Anyway, here's the Sauron mini we'll be using in the diorama. I drew a pencil outline where Sauron would be standing. I thought I'd use a 2mm brass rod to fix him to the diorama. So I drilled a 2mm hole into the underside of the Sauron mini using a small handheld pin vise drill. I fit the rod, marked it to length, then snipped it with some pliers to make a peg to be superglued into place. I marked the position on the rock base using a permanent marker, then drilled the hole to the same length in the rock. Once I was happy everything would fit in place okay, it was time to move on to the next stage and drill the holes inside the cavities for the LEDs. I'll be using 5mm mega LEDs, so I used a larger drill bit, large enough for the actual head of the LEDs to pass through the hole. Once that was done, the final step for this part of the build was to drill some connecting holes for running all the wiring between the two wooden frames from behind, so that all the LEDs could be connected to the same power source. And that's it for part 1 of our build. In our next episode, we'll finish off building and then paint our diorama, and paint and add all of the miniatures. And then of course we'll finish off with our final reveal. But that's enough hobbying adventures for today. We don't want to be late for dinner, do we? Thanks so much for watching everyone, and I'll see you all soon in our next episode. But until then, I regret to announce this is the end. I'm going now. Bye bye everyone. See you next time.